Why sustainability? Why did I choose this topic, and why is sustainability important for designers? And I really think sustainability plays a key role in the future of design. The internet is the biggest thing we're ever going to build as a species, as humanity. And we as designers, we actually play a key role shaping this future of the internet. We're just in the middle of it, and we can actually use it in a good way, or we can use it in a negative way. If you look at just the carbon emissions of the digital industry, IT and all things digital, is as high roughly as the aviation industry in total. Meaning we all know about the negative impact on carbon emissions in terms of like the aviation industry, but not a lot of people talk about the IT and digital industry. But the emissions are actually very similar. So I think culturally, a lot of people don't know about it. So there is a huge impact to make a positive contribution. And of course, as designers, we're in the middle of that digital industry and really create it and shape it in a huge way. In fact, 80% of emissions actually come from the decisions that are made in the design phase of a product. Meaning we are actually also in the phase where a lot of decisions are made. They could influence the carbon emissions of a product. And what is also interesting is that I think it's also a space for innovation, just like as accessibility and inclusivity are ways to ideate on things in a new way, or look at an existing and topic maybe you have been looking on a couple of times, look at it in a new way. It can really foster counterintuitive thinking. It can give you new perspectives that can actually be fuel for innovation. And I think as designers, we have to move away from the feeling that it's an obligation that we have to do it, but actually understanding it as an opportunity. And I think as designers, we have to also help our colleagues and people that we work with to understand that shift of mindset. It's not an it's an obligation, but it's also a huge opportunity. And I think if you internally try to convince people around the topic, you're going to have more chances by talking about an opportunity to push forward such a topic internally. I'm Sebastian Gier, and this is my design story. So you may wonder, why am I talking about this topic and what's my background? So I'm a co-founder of Footprint. We are a climate tech startup helping companies to reduce carbon emission using artificial intelligence and do this in record time, specifically for small to medium-sized businesses. And specifically, we will focus on efficiency and simplicity because the topic itself is highly complex. Personally, I have a background working in industry. I worked, for example, for almost 6 years with BMW before founding Footprint in the UX UI team as a design lead, working on various collaborations, for example, the in-car experience, basically the car experience inside in terms of digital experience, but also working on the mobile applications, mobile apps and strategy. I also work with Bosch, for example, Harvard, and some other institutes, and always have been a lot working with startups. I also run a podcast and conference called DesignDrives, where in the podcast I'm interviewing global design leaders on the positive impact of design. And I'm talking with them about their learnings in their industry. They're really senior design leaders who have been making a lot of learnings, how designers can have a positive impact. And impact can happen in multiple ways. It can either be, for example, on the business. It can be on the helping to evolve new technology, making people believe in new technology, evolving even science. Of course, as designers, we all like to focus on the human experience. We can have a positive experience on the human being, but we can also focus on the planet, sort of planet-centric and designing for the environment. And specifically, this is one part of impact I'm very interested in, besides being just generally interested in how designers can have a positive impact. I think specifically these days, everyone likes to talk about impact. Everyone likes to talk about the dream of the passion of having a job or doing something that has impact. But I think specifically if you look at younger people, but the question is always like, what does that mean for a designer? And I think it's interesting that there are multiple ways how we as designers can contribute. And I'm trying to make this tangible to my content and organization. So sustainability always has been playing a source of inspiration for me. And of course, I learned now a lot with working with all of these businesses that are using Footprint to reduce their carbon emissions, and what works, what doesn't, working also with creative teams inside these companies to see what we can do to reduce carbon emissions. Maybe just saying a few general things on the state of sustainability here is that overall, there are new regulations that foster transformation in the countries, focusing more on sustainability. There are also a lot of financial rewards, for example, with ESG on the investment market. Basically, the whole sort of overall industry is going top down, from top companies, from like large companies to smaller companies, slowly moving more and more in that direction. And there are political incentives also for these companies, governmental incentives also in place that foster this transformation. And as designers, we're playing a key role really to do this. And if we're looking just on overall, if we're just understanding the overall situation, the fact is that there are more greenhouse gas emissions in the industry more than ever in history. So we have an all-time high right now. But we also have huge goals of reducing carbon emissions. So this is basically, the EU is a good example. There's the most ambitious and most progressive player when it comes to the topic. Even the EU is not yet on track, at least like 2023, on like reaching their goals when it comes to sustainability. And I think we want to make a contribution really to reduce carbon emissions. What's also important to mention is that this always comes hand in hand with growth as well. I think, and I'm going to elaborate a little bit in that course, is that when you talk about sustainability and reducing, it doesn't mean the company is going to have less business or be less successful. It's actually the opposite. So you save money, you find new spaces to innovate, you create more sustainable business models, you also tap into new revenue markets, and actually you make your business future-proof. It's just a question when you take the step, and there are a lot of advantages for businesses to move rather quicker than being slower on this topic, because now it's also still something to stand out uniquely as a company. So there is, for example, a metric called emissions per revenue, right? So it's a good metric, for example, because it says like, well, the business can increase revenue, but it's about like how many emissions you need per revenue, right? So if you can lower that metric, for example, it's not about creating less revenue or having a less good business, but there are ways to create that win-win that you need internally between like the business and the environment. That's where designers need to get involved. In general, I think it's important to understand that the earlier we get involved as designers, the bigger our opportunities to make a difference. So yeah, the question is, when did I realize actually this is an important topic, and was there any kind of triggering event for me to kind of get into this? I mean, of course, I went into this with founding Footprint and, started to work with a lot of businesses on that. And then we make a lot of realizations. For example, it's way too complex for businesses. Businesses don't really know what decisions to make. And there's a big risk to tap into the so-called greenwashing trap. So businesses are afraid of making decisions that actually not have any positive impact at all. So this is a key problem, right? So if you have a lot of post-its wall on the wall and you asking yourself, okay, we cannot do all of these things, but the question is always, what actually is saving emissions and how much? And I think what we try to do at Footprint really focus on is that quantification part. So on each post-it, each idea, each innovation, any initiative a business want to do in that direction, we know we can actually tell the business, well, it's going to save you 3% of emissions, 5%, 20%, or maybe no emissions at all. But it's also a huge complex topic, meaning like there is the environmental side, there are carbon emissions, but there are also aspects like circularity, biodiversity, and oftentimes things are not really black and white. And I'm going to elaborate a little bit on that as well. I think overall we have sort of the topic is an alarming trend with the global emissions rising. And I think there is an opportunity for designers to get involved to address these issues. And yeah, I think it's better to, get active on the topic and see how you can contribute and get involved. Hopefully the course is going to help you a little bit to see like what you can do in your business, in your team you're working on to make a change. You may be wondering, what are the obstacles that are standing in the way for businesses and people to actually make a change? There is basically a clear need, but it's about making, specifically for smaller size businesses, it needs to be accessible and digestible, because as mentioned, the topic is very complex. There's sometimes not a black and white. And you need to do it and package it in a way where it's easy and accessible. And we do this in different ways. I'm going to elaborate on that in terms of frameworks that we're giving to teams, but also tools in order to make this as simple as possible. I'm basically also driven by the belief that if we have user-friendly tools and ways and frameworks for people to get active, then there will be change. It's also that oftentimes businesses don't even have the idea what they can do to reduce the carbon emissions. And I think that ideation is an important part. Nowadays, you can actually, you should always look first at the actual carbon emission profile. So you look at the emission profile of a company, of a product, of a project. And you're going to look at where in this overview are the biggest emissions. Is it on the transportation? Is it on the IT? And if you just zoom on a topic, let's say you only zoom into the topic of a digital product, you also can understand, is it on the use phase? So people using your digital product, is it on the data centers? Is it in the creation of the digital product and the software development processes? So where are the biggest emissions? And then you can focus on these areas, because of course it makes sense to focus on these areas where you can have the biggest impact. And there are even free calculators online to do this, and to get that understanding. Now, I think the other part is that besides understanding the sources of the emissions and the tools I was elaborating on, there's also a lack, of course, internally in terms of awareness. So oftentimes businesses internally also don't know that there is an opportunity to change something. So this is something where you can contribute by educating the people around you. And I think what's important there, generally speaking, is that you make this tangible for people in terms of the impact they can have. And this is why the quantification is so critical, that you actually understand, hey, if we do this together, if we, for example, roll out this feature or change our processes, or implement this new business strategy, we're going to save this amount of CO2, or even better, we save the certain percentage in relation to the absolute in terms of the emissions. And I think kind of embracing that, I think, is really important. And then, helping people on that. So basically it's about education. It's about making things simpler for people, educating people around you, and also creating the tools for people, creating the frameworks. And it's also about creating transparency in terms of the impact that can be there if we're making a change. And if you can actually show people, well, we're going to have a lot of impact, and actually we're going to save money, or we actually maybe increase the revenue. If you can find that win-win between the business and the environmental side, I think then you really have something that is in a good position to get move forward. So you may be wondering now, so if you listen to this course, what are the things you're going to learn from it? What are you going to take out of it? So actually, this course is really much focusing on helping you as a creative, as a designer, to know how to bring sustainability into your team, into your project, and how to specifically articulate with everything around impact. As I've been interviewing over 70 design leaders around the world, one of the key topics around designers having impact is around the way we communicate. And I think it's the same problem with sustainability. You need to communicate your design in a way where the other side is actually caring for what you want to do and want to change. And I'm always giving this example about, let's say, changing a button interface from blue to green. You should probably, if you're talking to your business stakeholders, you should probably not start with, well, it's going to look more beautiful. Well, it's going to look more beautiful, and you can tell your design colleagues that it looks more beautiful, and all of your design friends going to like it, and me, myself as a designer. But maybe the business person you're talking to, or the product owner, maybe needs to have a more tangible reason for changing the color, maybe as a very sort of simple example here, or doing any kind of larger design change. And I think you need to articulate it in a way where it matters for the opposite. And this is what we're going to talk a little bit in this course about. How do you can use the language of business to convince people? So you're going to talk about retention, conversion, adaption, and these kind of KPIs that are relevant for them. So we're going to talk about language. We're going to talk about mindset. We're going to talk about tools and process and methodologies in order to integrate into your project. And how can you convince your people and be equipped to drive positive impact on your product. And then you may be wondering, what are the challenges that this story is going to address? It's really a focus to inspire people around the positive impact we can have as designers. I think as designers, we like to have more power. Everyone likes to have more power. We like to complain about the fact that we're not having enough power and that other people maybe are more powerful than us in the company. But in fact, I think it's all up to us. I'm talking to design leaders very often, and how can you change the perception of what design is in a company? And the best way to start is to start with yourself and not looking for the mistakes on others. And you can actually influence that. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about that. Basically, how can you grow the value of design with the topic? How can you get the knowledge and skills, which is a key problem? Designers don't really know what they can do, specifically on the strategic and the operational side. And then also how you can frame it in a way that people understand that this is actually about the future of the business and the product. So if we can influence business strategy, if we can influence product requirement, then we have a big opportunity. But I'm going to also talk about opportunities down the road when it comes to actually more the implementation. On the beginning part, it's going to be a lot about envision how futures could work out, prototyping, making people believe and driving confidence. I think in general, what's interesting is that when it comes to the power of design, if you are a designer that is a really great communicator, with someone that can connect people in the company, can excite people around a vision, you're also going to have a good chances to push forward sustainability, because I think the skill sets designer need in order to drive the topic forward are very similar to general design leadership skills or general things about understanding business and the intersection of business and design. So as designers, we play a key role. And I think in this course, I'm going to talk about two specific parts. The one side being the strategic side, how designers can influence process, decisions, vision, requirements. On the other side, what if designers are more operational and actually more working with an existing brief and more on the execution side, implementation side, development side? What can we do as designers in order to make a change? So let's dive into it. Let me introduce you a little bit into the topic and understand a little bit more what the process is like and what the vision behind the topic is. So I think what's really important is to understand, again, the aspect that you can either work on the strategic side or you can influence things on the operational side. But you can also look at process, product, and use. So what do I mean with that? On the one side, the process. How do you actually create your design? So this is everything around like what kind of technology are people using? Like if you have it in a design system, for example, if you have a design system, you can reduce emission. So that's everything around like how do you come to the materialization of your idea? Okay, that's the process. Process is also, of course, like being involved in strategy. Yeah. The another part is the product itself. So how can you reduce the outcome of, or more in fact, actually the output of what you create? How can you reduce the emissions of that? And then the use phase is actually the outcome. So what are actually the emissions of people using your technology? And you not just have to look at how much emissions does a website loading behavior take, right? Like how much emission does the site from a website is. It's a bit more complex than that, because you also show information on your website, right? You also show information in your digital product. So how does that actually influence behavior around what you create is part of the use phase? And it's not as straightforward as just tracking like how big the website is, you know? It's about like what happens in the brain of the person that you're designing for. So it's another way to kind of look at it: process, product, use phase. But if I would go just with the analogy of strategy and operations, if we're just moving forward with that, I think what is interesting also to keep in mind is that you can actually, with the topic, and we have been learning this constantly working with these businesses, that we go into a collaboration with a business and may start with the idea of we want to create sustainability. So we maybe look at the product in an ideation session, and we kind of look into what could be ways how to make this more sustainable. And what happens is that when you do this ideation around what could be done, and again, you should start with first analyzing, right? So first you start with analyzing the emissions of that artifact, meaning the whole business. So that's what we do very often. Like we look at the whole business, or we look at a project. So you first do an analyzation. So you see kind of a chart, like how your emissions are mapping out. And you can dig deeper. You can look at what are like the detailed parts of that, right? And then I think it's important to, from there on, if you have the ideation session, to think about ways how to reduce emissions. Now, what's interesting is that when you do this, you come across, you get a lot of ideas that are actually maybe like they're not saving as much emissions, but they're great innovations. And I think this is an underrated way to kind of look at sustainability, okay? Let's say you look at the same topic you have been looking 100 times on, but you look at the same topic from a different angle. And this is actually nothing new. This is the same. For example, what I also like to talk about is like the power of diversity, inclusivity, and all of these topics in the product design process. Because if you embrace these things, you're going to come up with just more ways to look at the same problem to solve. Okay. And by that, you increase the creativity, and by therefore you increase the ability to innovate. Yeah. So I think a good way to kind of look at it is Nike. So Nike years ago, again, showed a new shoe that was done in a way where it was automatically tying and you don't have to use your hands, right? And the storyline of that was, well, you can do it without hands, and it's made for people that have a disability. So they were looking from this problem from the perspective of accessibility, right? They looked at a shoe, one of the most designed products that is out there. Like a lot of designers have been dealing with this product, and they came up with a different way. And the reason they came up with a different way is because they have been looking at the same thing differently. Think differently. And I think that's so important. So in this case, about accessibility, what happens is that this shoe that you can tie automatically is not just beneficial for the people that are not having any hands or just one hand. It's actually beneficial for everyone. You cannot start with, that is not an important use case. You say like, well, this is not the core of the business. Or you say like, well, this is not the most important thing to solve. We don't need to solve this. No, actually, even if you don't believe into a topic, even if it's like sustainability, but you can take any kind of similar topic, it's an opportunity to innovate. There's an unused space for innovation. And this is also like oftentimes described as counterintuitive thinking, okay? Counterintuitive thinking is like we are all biased. We're looking at a problem space, we're looking at it, and we're thinking about how can you solve this problem. And there's automatic mechanism in place, like how we're trying to approach a problem. But you need to stop your sort of standard ways of problem solving. You need to interrupt that and do an intervention and kind of look at it from a different perspective. And it's the same with sustainability here. So if you're working with these businesses, for example, recently we worked with a big healthcare company. And we looked into how could emissions get reduced on their customer journey. We came across a lot of ideas that they were actually not ideas to reduce carbon emissions. They were actually business innovations. Yeah. And this is exactly what I'm trying to say. It's like you by looking at something from a new perspective, you come up with complete new ideas. And an understated, I think, advantage of sustainability is the innovation character. For that, we actually developed a framework as well as like an open source framework for companies to kind of ideate on ways to reduce carbon emissions, like a carbon reduction innovation canvas. And yeah, so I think that's important. I think another thing that is important is to bring in multiple people, also from the implementation side. So if you try to innovate something, and it's the same again with normal innovation, right? So you're trying to create something new in a company. So you are very much involved in the strategy phase. Then it's really important to bring in the people from implementation, because otherwise nothing gets ever implemented. Because there is something called the not invented here syndrome. And everyone that has to deal with innovation knows about this. So if you're trying to do something in the silo and you don't tell your PO or you don't tell anyone like that you kind of want to do it, and you're not open to opinions, you just want to push it through and then present it as sort of the final answer to everything, you're going to have the most amazing idea, but people are not going to implement it, and the reason for that, they haven't been part of the creation process. You need to make people feel heard. And specifically, everyone knows this in an innovation process in the beginning. It's not about judging an idea. So it's not about like telling someone, hey, your idea doesn't work. No, it's about making people heard, making sure you get all the opinions, get the diversity of opinion out there, not just for the sake also of just having them involved and like the fact that they're more likely to implement it if they have been participating, but also for the creativity aspect, So it's just like every idea, how bad or good it are, can trigger another idea. The way our brain works is very often that we are combining different ideas into a new idea, So I think that's also to consider. But then also you want to get them involved for the chance of implementation. And even if they cannot join the meeting, if they cannot participate, and when we talk about people on implementation, this can be developers, this can be programmers, this can be engineers, this can be operators, manufacturers. So you want to get them involved straight from the start in a strategy phase. And I think this is a great way, generally speaking, right? So if you are able to create a space and connect people in a way where they actually becoming like the author of the idea, is great, because that's the only way everything moves forward. And something also around designers actually be feeling like we got a baby if we have like a cool idea and like we want to protect it, we want to have it survive, and like then suddenly someone steals it and someone else presents it, right? Or maybe it comes back like 2 years later. That's just the nature of things, and actually it's a good thing. If someone has been stealing the idea and like it gets implemented maybe 2 years down the road or from a different perspective, or someone picks up the idea and thinks it was their idea, you should embrace it and rather see like how can it implement it, because it's a good sign. And there's always the right timing for things. Sometimes maybe it's just the wrong timing, and then things can get done at a later point. So try to bring as many people, diverse people into the topic. I think another great way to kind of look at it is the fact that we as designers, we know about service design, or you can use service design. Service design as a discipline is perfectly positioned to actually drive positive change. The reason for that is, from a service design perspective, and this is a great way to kind of look into, if you bring your stakeholders together to use a service design framework, because you look at the process from very beginning to the end. And in fact, we have been working with companies where you have a user journey and you can analyze the mission created on that user journey. And then you can kind of dig into that particular part of user journey and can say like how you can find ways to ideate on that. But the reason why service design is such a great approach, because you automatically have that broad perspective on a customer experience, on the employee experience, on a product. Yeah, so products, even like creation of product, or like again what I was saying earlier, like process, product, usage. Right. And then like, how is that map out? And you can think about like different ways how to reduce carbon emissions. That's something I would also like to mention here, is using a service design approach. Service design thinking is a great book to kind of deal with that, and something I can really recommend. And then we're going to talk now a little bit about like that strategic phase. How can we help to strategize to create more sustainable solutions? And then how can we, if we are more work on implementation with the developers, with the engineers, how can we cut carbon there? So if we kind of start with how can we reduce carbon emissions on the strategic side? Sustainability requires collaboration. There's no alternative. Why is this so important? We talk a lot about participatory design when it comes to sustainability, or participatory innovation, or participatory transformation, you can also say. So again, it's the factor that you need to have the alignment on the bottom of the organization. It's not just, it's about the bottom up, and it's also about the top down, meaning like the management needs to understand that this is an important topic. If that's not given, it's an uphill battle. We can talk a little bit about that as well, like how you can get there. But I think that's an important aspect. So you need to have the top-down aspect, meaning like generally speaking, like people are in favor of the topic and they think it's an important topic. It's even better if there are reward systems in place. So basically, the business rewards efforts that are actually leading to carbon reduction or more sustainable efforts. And this is a management discussion. It's maybe not something you can influence the designers besides maybe raising the topic internally. But of course, one factor that influences the decision-making in companies is what gets rewarded. What gets rewarded? And of course, there are a lot of things that get rewarded. For example, revenue. Everyone I can drive revenue for the business, of course. But there is also, of course, other metrics. As for example, I was already saying revenue per emission, right? Or emission per revenue. So this is, of course, like a number. So everyone that contributes to lower that number or that KPI, I think can be, there can be financial incentives in a company, reward systems in place where, this is articulated in the communication internally. Because in the end, every department, every team usually has some kind of KPIs they're working towards. I know even as a design team and a product team, I'm pretty sure if you're asking your PO, they have some kind of KPIs they're working towards that the CEO told them they should embrace and improve. So the question is, from a top-down side, it's good that if there are incentives in place, if people get rewarded for reaching sustainability goals. So of course, like there, as designers, you can very much just get involved by educating people and bringing up the topic internally. Also, just from a factor of innovation. Again, like I would come with the factor of advantages that your organization has by embracing it. I talked about innovation. Yeah. Nowadays, there's an uncertainty, right? There's a lot of uncertainty around the world. And I think it was interesting if you're looking at how uncertainty can lead to creativity, okay? Uncertainty nurtures creativity, right? If you're not under stress, if you're not in a situation to change, you may not change, okay? As human species, we always have been evolving because we kind of have to. And we are, like, this is one of our superpowers as the human species, that we are able to adapt. So I think this is an important component. So kind of like talking about the advantages of transforming the company towards a more sustainable future, and sustainable also in the sense of creating a more sustainable business model, getting to maybe younger target groups, and all of these things, driving more business. There is overlaps to like the sustainability, the broader term, and environmental aspects. But of course, in this course, I'm specifically focusing on the environmental part of sustainability, right? Finding that win-win between like the strategy and the environmental side is like really important. So basically educating, embracing that, and making people aware. Then when it comes to the actual carbon emission reduction, I already outlined basically the fact of bringing multiple people together, collaboration. And there's another good example on this. If you are a sustainability manager in a company, everyone may think that you are responsible for sustainability in the company. So we don't have to care, right? It's your problem, right? It's not really like this. So the sustainability manager in a company is relying on other people to make the efforts. That person is primarily there from a strategic point of view to understand like where are the biggest opportunities, but then also has to bring in different people together to actually implement things. Right? Because in the end, it's going to be the product, it's going to be the business operations, it's going to be the way like the employee experience is, HR, etc. So it's always going to be the collaboration between the sustainability manager and all kind of different teams. Now, a problem a sustainability manager sometimes has is that they have to go to other teams that are busy with something else and then convince them that they need to do something for that person. Right? And this is a challenge, right? But the challenge is kind of the same with anything. Really, if you want to drive internal change, isn't it? That's the kind of the same we as designers, right? Well, you could say the same thing. You could say like, well, you're the designer, so you are responsible for the design, right? So if the product doesn't look good or it's not a good experience, you're responsible for it. Well, kind of, but also kind of not, because in the end, it's about like other people understanding that there is value and then helping you to implement that. It's a good example. I'm always talking about that. There is no good design without good engineering. In fact, some of the best designs are based on good engineering. If you're looking at Apple, for example, great products. Everyone celebrates them for their product design. But if you look at how the products actually made, you see that the actual innovation is in the engineering. So what they do is they just say, okay, we want to create a better design. So we need more engineers, and actually may go the extra mile on the manufacturing to have a hinge going into a different way, to a product to animate different. So they go the extra mile on the implementation side. Something that is very often also misunderstood. If people say like, well, like our product is not well designed, so we need more designers. No, maybe we need more engineers, because we have all of these great design ideas, but they're not getting implemented. We don't have enough capacity. Common thing, right? If people saying about like the designers have all these ideas about motion and things that the product can do, and then nothing gets implemented or is stuck on the roadmap, it's very often a problem. It's not about like not having enough designers, but it's oftentimes not having enough engineers. So you can start to take design seriously. We're kind of mapping it out on the sustainability front. It's kind of the same way. You need the capacity and resources from other people in the company to actually make positive change. So understand that you as designer, in the conversation of sustainability, you are a connector. You don't have to come up with the answers, right? You may not even know what has the most emission savings. You bring in a sustainability person, or you maybe not even have a person internally in the team that can bring in this topic. So it's not about you coming up or taking full responsibility on the topic. You should take responsibility of bringing it into discussion and raising awareness and educating people around you and showing up opportunities. But you don't have to put the burden on you to kind of like come up with the best ideas. And actually, it can be counterintuitive when you put the burden on you to do this. It's about creating a space and helping people to imagine what could be. So I always say one of the superpowers designers have is the ability to make the abstract concrete, to make the intangible tangible, to materialize the abstract. This is the absolute superpower designers have, and it's an overlooked superpower. Because as designers, we don't want to be seen as the people who are just the things that make things, giving it some kind of visual, right? Or some kind of look, or some kind of like manifestation, some kind of like abstract, some kind of artifact. But as designers, that's actually one of the key superpowers we can now integrate into the topic of sustainability. So when you talk about making a product more sustainable, there are best practices I'm going to go into, but it's also about just having a discussion and brainstorming, maybe even a design thinking session where people around the topic and connecting people. And you as designers, well, the superpower you have is you may not know about some engineering details, you may not know about the marketing strategy, and maybe the HR people, they're also more experts in something else. It's not about you coming up with the ideas, but it's maybe you being able to connect the dots and coming up with the right communication, and communication as a broader term. Communication, design is always communication, but sort of visualizing it in a way where people start to believe it. I'm always saying like design is about making people believe. And this starts at the very foundational. If handing something to a developer, the developer are going to believe that he can do it because he sees the interface in its full beauty, and he's motivated now to program it that way. And even you can excite developer for your work if you're a good communicator. So I think it's important to understand that you don't have to come up with the answers, but you need to make people believe what is possible. And this can be anything that starts with, I'm going to say like materialization. This can be anything starting with you being in a meeting and you doodling something on a whiteboard, or you're taking a few post-its, documenting like the discussion. I had a good friend of mine, actually. In fact, he is a service designer. He was also always participating meetings with a lot of people that are from business side, from requirement side, from marketing side, and all of these people. They of course they know their topic, they know their domain, and they know what's important. They know which kind of decisions to make for the business. But the problem is, if you have a lot of these people in the room, they use their words for communication. That's why they sometimes designers are not the best with verbal communication, because we are used to express ourselves differently. I don't have to rely on our verbal communication very often to articulate ourselves. That's where we don't develop that skill sometimes as good as other disciplines that are not able to put a nice PowerPoint together or like an interesting drawing. So they are better at verbal communication very often. Salespeople, for example, have to be really good with that. So the problem now comes if you have a lot of abstract ideas in the room, nothing gets pushed forward because everyone thinks about life slightly different. But if two people talk about, let's say, an elephant in some kind of environment that is pink and has like small ears, for example, right? Then everyone going to have a slightly different elephant in their mind, right? And I mean, elephant is now a simple example, but if you're talking a more abstract idea, let's say a new business model, you start to materialize that in your mind and start to imagine. We as designers, we have actually good imagination. So it's one of our superpowers as well. What we can now do is we can articulate these visions, right? So we can draw things out. And the friend I was pointing out, he basically, as the discussion is happening, he live draw boards things on the wall to make people come together around an idea and start to believe into that future, emotionalize that future, what it could be. And people start to believe into it. Yeah. It's not about being right. Maybe you're doodling it up, you're creating the first prototype, you're drawing the picture, you're creating the presentation. They kind of summarize the idea, and people are going to tell you afterwards, well, Peter, this is not what we have thought about. This is not like how the discussion went, right? But maybe someone else says that's exactly what I meant. So it's, again, just bringing people together. It's an ideation step, okay? So you bring people together with one step of ideation, one step of methodization to, again, a point where they can discuss things. I'll tell you another example is the automotive industry, for example, show cars. All of these automotive companies, they're putting out show cars, how the future of mobility is going to feel like, how the future of a car could look like, and all of these things, right? A couple of years out. And I always think like it's such an amazing way to kind of bring people together around the vision. Because again, you can look at this and you can say like, yeah, pretty close, maybe a couple of things here, and maybe we actually meant something different around this topic, but actually you're way closer to the truth or to the common sense of what people want to do than keeping it in the abstract. So this is a superpower designer have. We can accelerate in process of transformation by just being the best support in materializing ideas and bring things as quick as possible from the abstract to the concrete. Okay, so this is your job as a designer. Yeah, contribute to that. You don't have to have the ideas. You can just bring people together, have them ideate from the different expertise domain, being it HR, development, etc. But then like contribute from your point of view with making things concrete and facilitate that. In fact, what's interesting here is that it's not just about maybe creating new revenue as argumentation to push things forward. It's also about actually saving costs. So I think that's sort of an important way to look at the role of design in that process. And then also, as mentioned, it's really important now, as you sort of like try to combine ideas and rate ideas, you need to look at a framework. And this framework is sort of a framework that you already know, probably. You have to find a win-win between the technology, basically having something that is easy to implement. Yeah. That's maybe even not the most critical aspect if you have enough other reasons for it. You need something that actually has desirability. So basically that people are actually going to use, actually has benefits for the customer, right? That's an important component as well. We as designers, of course, this is our favorite part. Then the viability. So is it actually driving anything from a business point of view? And then the environmental side. So you have usually I think we're talking about three domains: feasibility, viability, desirability. Now you have a fourth one, which is the environmental or the sustainability side. That person doesn't sit at the table. You have the developer, the marketing person, and the designer sitting at the table. They discuss all of their needs, but the sustainability person, unlikely that person is going to sit at the table as well if you decide on something. So everyone has to wear this hat, okay? And you can try to wear that hat as a designer and try to bring this. And again, like with the, as I mentioned in the beginning, like the changing a button on an interface is the same thing here again. Like, how can you create a win-win? Yeah. Specifically with the business side, I always think like that's where you have the biggest leverage. Yeah, because in the end, that's usually how a company is going to be operating, right? If it's good, if they're good arguments from a business perspective, you're going to find some reasons for it. So usually the framework we're using is CO2 saved. That's a key number you can identify. Then cost, initial cost. Is it costing something or actually saving money? But it's an initial investment needed. How much is the initial investment? How about the running cost? Do we actually going to save things on the long run or actually have a running cost? So what's the running cost on that idea? So emissions, initial cost, running cost. Can be savings again, right? You can save. Then the marketing value. So how does that basically create benefits for me in terms of communication? Is this like an idea we do that actually saves emissions and is great communication outside? So people are going to listen to that and think like, wow, they have been coming up with a great idea here. Yeah, marketing value. And then the other one, efforts. How much effort it is to create, like to push down the idea and like implement it, right? And if you're using this framework, you can rate ideas. Yeah, so you can say like, well, it's okay. We want to save emissions, so this is cost neutral. It's good marketing and it saves emissions. No brainer. Okay, we have an idea that maybe saves a little bit less emissions, but it's so good for marketing. Yeah, and it's actually going to save us money. We want to do it as well. Yeah, so have a decision matrix that can help you to articulate the decision making. Yeah, and then you bring people together, you ideate on things, how to reduce emissions, you rate the idea based out of the matrix that I was describing, and then make a decision. I think another important component here is that you don't want to ideate on a topic too broad. Try to stay concrete, okay? And, like there are a lot of discussions around always like, is a persona good or bad? Like, does it make sense or not to have a persona? I think, I always look at a persona also just from a pure creativity leverage perspective, because, well, if you look at something concrete, you're going to find like that work with the material, that work with the restriction, going to drive creativity. It's better you come up with more creative ideas if you take a particular topic and really ideate on that particular topic, very concrete, instead of you keeping it too broad. Because if you're too broad, your mind wanders in too many directions. And creativity comes from depth as well, right? Innovation comes from depth. So basically, try to restrict yourself with the overall topic. Don't say like, how can we make this business more sustainable? And you give yourself 50 minutes. So no, take one particular topic and then drill deep into this topic. Yeah? And then work with your stakeholders on that, because just the pure fact that you kind of deal with a topic in its detail going to nurture creativity and nurture more opportunities to innovate. And actually, you're going to find out like extra ways to reduce carbon, because otherwise you're going to always stay at the high level surface. And you also don't come up with anything that maybe you think like someone else maybe has already thought about. So I think that's sort of the last important component. And well, I think like if you are able to get involved in the strategy phase, that's like, I think, where you can have the biggest impact as a designer, if you can get involved there, if you can participate in that. Another thing to think about in the strategy phase is think about the user behavior we want to create. And Matt Waller wrote a good book around this called Start at the End. And actually, it says basically you have a goal that you set yourself a user behavior outcome goal. So what is the actual customer behavior you want to create? And you can ask yourself also, talking about use phase, how you can do something in a way that maybe the end user is going to save emissions in the actual usage phase. And for this, you can have that ideation from the very beginning, because if you have that North Star in place, if you say like we're designing towards action X, everything leading towards that point is gonna it's always like a way to filter throughout ideas, because you can always say, well, our mission is to do X or Y or Z, and so that's why it's really important to have that sort of user behavior North Star that you want to create. And this could be also a great topic you can take for yourself. It's so-called scope 3 or scope 4 emissions, it's called, and sort of in the way kind of it's measured, and it's basically not just basically the product itself you put out, but also like what happens afterwards. Okay, how are people actually using a product? The climate sprint is a design sprint for sustainability, or the climate, so to say. The climate sprint is a framework we have been developing that allows businesses to reduce carbon emissions in a short amount of time. So it's using the same process like the design sprint, but for the climate. And we had to change some things to kind of make it happen. It starts with analyzation. You look at a footprint of a product, company, or project. You look at where the biggest emissions. You drill deep. You make people in your group realize where the opportunity is to save. Then the next step, you create that context and then think about ways how in certain areas of that product emissions can be saved. You can create groups. We have a framework for that. It's a canvas, like a business design canvas or a business innovation canvas, where you can articulate an idea and kind of evaluating from different perspectives. Again, desirability, feasibility, viability, sustainability, or environmental. And then look into this idea particularly and kind of flesh it out and then rate it. And we then use systems in order to calculate the quantification. So from there on, you're able to actually tell with the tool how many emissions are going to get saved with this idea. So you can say, oh, this idea is going to save 12% emission, 13, 15, 20, 50, or 1. So this is what you can find out. And then the next step is about the engagement character. So then in the last step, it's about engaging people around the implementation of that, communicating what the impact is going to be and keeping track of the process. So that's a climate sprint. Usually, this can be done like in one workshop, but it has to be prepared. And there is, of course, like a part afterwards. And we call it like analyze, reduce, engage. And helping businesses to cut carbon in rapid time. So what can you do if you are not able to contribute to the strategy, the requirement side in your company, and you're stuck with an existing brief and you just want to make a difference on the product that you have and you're not able to change a lot of things around? Common, of course, use case for designers. I think the goal is to work yourself towards the strategy phase. Yeah, find ways to contribute. But if that's not your opportunity, you can still do a lot, actually, in fact. So if you are looking into the carbon reduction of your digital product, there are multiple ways to do that. So I think one way to kind of look at it is the information you actually show to the user. What is the information you show to the user, and how, for example, can you integrate things like, for example, environmental data into an interface to make someone aware of, for example, their carbon emissions? This is always a tricky discussion because every space and interface is, people fight for this space in the interface, right? And like, why should you now integrate the CO2 number, right? If it is counterproductive on the business side, you're going to have a hard time arguing for that. But I think what oftentimes, specifically with digital products, people don't understand that it is oftentimes a very positive aspect around maybe using a digital product they could emphasize. And this is also called scope 4 emissions. So it's basically how much emissions get saved by using your product. Yeah. So you can calculate that. It's also called, it used to be called as green by IT. Okay. Your IT solution, your digital solution has a positive impact on the environment by people using a digital product for it, for example, or just to the way they're using the product. And you can actually calculate that and then show this number. Like, the problem now with the CO2 number is like, people don't really know what that means. Okay, 12 kilograms CO2. What is that, a lot or a little? People have no clue. People know what $12 or 12 euros mean, but with CO2, they don't know it. And I don't know if they will ever. But what you can still do is you can compare it. So, for example, you can say 12 kilograms CO2, for example, is this amount of beef burgers, or is this amount of, let's say, travel by a car for 30 kilometers with a petrol engine? So you can basically put comparison in that make people realize what that means if you compare it against an activity, for example, taking a shower, eating a burger, or taking a car. So that is a good way to kind of find a comparison. And we always work a lot with that. And we kind of like tell people like a real life example that gives them some kind of context around the impact of the action. If you figure out there's a way of this product where it actually has a positive impact, it actually can motivate people to do a certain action in your digital product, it's going to be easier to bring into discussion. A good way of that is, for example, Lime Bike. I was using them a couple of years ago, and after you have been taking the bike there, it's going to tell you how much CO2 you have been saving by taking the bike, and how much emissions that is, and how many minutes with car. And you can actually share it on social media, right? And people do that. I think I even did it back then. So it motivates people actually to share about it. People are proud of, like, if they save emissions, and they can actually be an ambassador for your product. Think about the information you show. Think about, like, do you have something that is positive around your product? And then another thing to kind of look at that is everything post-conversion. So usually in a digital product, you have sort of like discovery, and maybe like there's some kind of point where the money is earned, Everything that doesn't interfere with the conversion even motivates, or basically you have it pointed out after the conversion. Like, for example, I was with a Lime bike, for example. It's a lot easier to have that discussion in the product team from my learning. That way, you're not interfering with the product experience. You have it as a factor of educate people, showing them maybe also different options, but you are not interfering necessarily with the actual product core function, for example, right? But you can still make the user understand that you're standing up for an environment. And in fact, there are a lot of statistics these days that show that people prefer companies and brands that are standing up for the environment in the decisions, like whether they buy, what products they're using, which companies they work for. So it can have multiple advantages. So another way to kind of look into saving emissions on your digital product is to reduce the flow steps. So how many steps there are to reducing emissions. And I think this is also something very often misunderstood, but good UX is very often sustainable, if that makes any sense. So if you actually have a good UX, you're actually reducing emissions already. So a good UX is by default usually more sustainable or reducing less emissions. So reducing steps the user has to take to fulfill their action, finding ways to reduce the cognitive load, because the more distracted the user is, the more they have to, they're going to be basically not finding the action to take, and the longer it's going to take. It's also about, for example, responsible content strategies. So really think about the content you're putting out and if it adds value or if it's just spam, making sure that your content is actionable. So if you put on a piece of content, make sure people can do something with it and they don't have to go back and searching for it. So that's why hyperlinks, you could argue, are making your product more sustainable because your product becomes like actionable. Another way to look at it is design systems. Design systems can actually really drive for sustainability because it also makes the process more sustainable because you can develop faster, you can reuse components. There's a lot of advantages on the product emissions. So having a design system can save emissions. You can also, on the interface colored side, people always ask like, what's the most sustainable color? And so basically the darker the display, the more sustainable it is, at least on OLED displays. But it's a tricky topic because in terms of sustainability, you don't want to interfere with the brand. You don't want to necessarily make everything black just for the sake of saving emissions. But generally speaking, dark interfaces have less emissions. An exception is maybe blue, which actually uses a lot more energy. For example, even looking at the sort of more brighter colors, blue is kind of standing out because the brightest color. Then we have fonts and icons. If you can use standard fonts that are out of the system, there don't have to be no loading for the fonts, like Google font systems, for example, are really good with that. SVGs are better than PNGs because it's a vector. It can be it's better to load. Image size is one of the biggest things you can do. But image size is also the website heaviness. So if you reduce the website heaviness, you can save emissions. You can switch to a green hosting provider, right? That's going to play a key role. You can set yourself a performance budget. So you can look at how much emissions does a comparable website take and how can I reduce my score to be less. So you can measure that and you can say like, okay, we set our goal to work towards that KPI over the next months or years. You should look into what you want to track, because the more tracking you build in, the more emissions are going to get created. So don't track stuff that is unnecessary. And if you find ways to use server-side caching, that's also a way to reduce emissions. So these are some of the ways how you can reduce emissions on your digital product if you're kind of more executing an existing product brief. Okay, so you may be wondering which kind of tools you can use to drive forward sustainability. I already mentioned the climate sprint framework that we are using a lot with companies to cut emissions. But then I think like overall the tools are actually very much similar to the tools you're already using, right? I think like using an innovation framework, for example, climate sprint, then you can use like analyzation tools. We have an analyzation tools with Footprint in terms of like how to calculate carbon emissions, but there are other tools as well that do this to some degree to quantify what the impact is going to be. Because as mentioned, if you can tell people their number, it's a lot more easier to convince people. And you know what you do, you don't do greenwashing, okay? So you have a carbon quantification tool to understand like the action you're actually taking, how much emission you're going to save. Lastly, I think like the tools itself, very similar to that you're already using. I mentioned the service design framework can be really helpful, but then I think it is not so much about the tools, but rather, as mentioned, about your approach, mindset, and language. Another tool I was pointing out towards like the tools you can use towards like reducing carbon emissions of the product is performancebudget.io, for example, that you can use to like track like your performance budget. I think like some of the other things, they're going to be easily available via Google search if you're looking for particular things to kind of implement. I think the tools overall very similar to that are already using, besides the quantification part. I think that's important, that you know what you're doing. But then I think it's more about your approach and language. So don't look for the excuses in the tools, basically. So I already mentioned it's really important that you quantify your results. So you're using a carbon quantification tool like Footprint, for example, so you know what you're doing. In general, with the climate sprint framework, this open source framework we're using, businesses usually get a 30% carbon reduction potential on the savings side within one sprint. That depends then how many things they're going to actually implement, but this is sort of like our learning so far, that within one workshop you can, on average, at least in our experience, find, it depends on the topic in the end, but you can find like around like 30%. You may find even more or less, 30% carbon reduction potential for the business to save. And that's a really, really strong number. 30% is quite a lot, right? And I think what we learned is that it really comes down to which one you're going to take. It comes down to the decision again, the prioritization and balance between sustainability, desirability, feasibility, viability, finding the win-win on the side with your different stakeholders you work with and the language you're using. So how is the whole topic coming along in the design industry? I think like what's exciting is like more and more communities coming up where people get together on the topic, which I think is super exciting. The community, for example, like SUX, Sustainability UX groups, Sustainable Web Design groups. I think designers want to get involved. I think they haven't understood yet like how, but they want to get involved. It's exciting. Tools becoming more available. We work at Footprint also on like tools and make this as accessible as possible for people. And I think the topic itself gets more and more important. So I think this is going to grow over the next years. And I think it's in a few years, we're going to look at this topic as we do these days on testing your product on accessibility metrics. It's going to be as simple as that to test your product on maybe environmental aspects. So I think it's just going to take time. So let's finish up with one concrete example, how we reduce carbon emissions for a company. So I'm going to take the example again of the healthcare company. They have a physical product, but they have a lot of service system around. So we looked at the whole customer experience. And then we kind of looked at where the most emissions on that digital journey. And we kind of focus on these areas. And I think what's really interesting there is that, again, you had a lot of innovations coming out of that, right? And also, it was really important to bring in different people. So people that were actually involved in the end of the customer journey, they were able to contribute to the beginning part and vice versa. What's, I think, overall important is that you make transparent around the positive impact that can be created. You have enough space to discussion, because you can have a brainstorming like in the discussion itself. So you can basically say 50% brainstorming and then 50% discussion in terms of like the time. Of course, like there's more activities before and after. The discussion around the topic that drills deeper into a particular area, and that way you generate even more ideas. So I think that is important. And what's always amazing is like how many ideas can be created in a short amount of time. I think in this workshop, we did 80 ideas coming out in 8 minutes. So you get a lot of ideas in this case, but you had like 50% of these ideas were duplicates. So basically there were a lot of ideas that were either 2 times there or 3 times there because people have similar ideas, but you can just bring these people and or like these ideas then together, but still a lot of unique ideas. And again, what we found out is that if you look at something from a user journey perspective, as you're ideating here, you may come up with an idea like somewhere in the beginning of the user journey and vice versa. And you come up with new business models. I think this was a really interesting example for us where I think the outcome was so interesting from an innovation perspective we haven't expected. Thank you so much for listening to this course. You can always reach out to me for more advice or more tips. I'm always looking forward to help people with the topic, and I'm excited that you, as a person listening to this, have been going through that content and want to get more educated, and hopefully have been learning something throughout the course. So congratulations on that, and wishing you all the best implementing some of these ideas.